Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Squadron Cocktail Hour Zoom room. Tonight's topic is the tides on Sydney Harbour, and it's part of our usual, well, not you, we've done it once before, but a series on sailing on Sydney Harbour and how we sail on the harbour. Our panel tonight is our expert panel of Mark Bethwaite, Ian Macdiarmid and Richard Lawson, the three of whom have had massive experience on Sydney Harbour and elsewhere, and a great amount of knowledge to impart to anybody who wants to know the tricks of getting around about on Sydney Harbour and the tide and the wind and understanding how it works. What I thought we'd do is pose a question to the panel. And the question is this: how important are tides on Sydney Harbour? And we'll ask Mark Bethwaite first how important he thinks they are, and we'll kick on from there. So Mark, over to you. How important are tides on Sydney Harbour?
Phil, thank you, and good evening to you, my fellow panellists and squadron members listening in. Tides are important, but I am always somebody who considers wind is more important. So anything that I say, I'd like you to overlay with the thought that that wind is the most important. Tide is secondary, but can still be important, particularly at times of high current, of high tidal current, such as with spring tides, the sort of tides we get around Christmas traditionally, and often around Easter. So the golden rule, I think, for sailing in tide on Sydney Harbour is if the tide is favourable, if you're on the northeast course and you have an ebb tide, then tend to favour the mid-channel rather than the edges, for obvious reasons. There's more flow in mid-channel. And if the tide is unfavourable, try and then choose a side, and importantly, don't cross the harbour more than you have to. Choosing a side really comes back to my opening comment that wind is important. So Phil, I might just pause there by way of opening comment.
Thanks, Mark. Ian, you're always somebody that's got an opinion on where to be and how to be there. So what do you think is the importance of tide on the harbour?
I've got to agree totally with Mark, but I want to put a proviso
He is your old
there.
skipper, mind you.
Sorry?
He is your old skipper.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I usually do, as I'm told, but not always. But the main proviso there is if you're sailing an Ingling and you're in a knot of tide or 0.8 of a knot of tide on a boat that's sailing at 4 knots, that is a very, very big plus or a big minus. If you're on a 50-footer, a modern 50-footer that's sailing at 8.5 knots to windward, then it's a much lesser amount to consider. And then Mark's proviso of having be in the pressure, stay in the gusts and in the angles. So that's my only comment there. But I've got to say, I've put in some appalling performances where in winter where there's very little wind and the wind drops out, and the people or the boats that when the wind dropped out were sitting in the deepest part of the channel and in the strongest tide made me look pretty damn ordinary.
What about you?
Macca, it follows then, doesn't it, that wind is important. In other words, strength of wind is important in considering how much attention you should pay to tide. I'll throw that question open to both Macca and to Mark.
And also Dick, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dick. Yeah.
Richard, what about some comments from you? How do you see this? What's your take? You're on mute. Very good.
Apologise for that. Yes, Mark must have read my script that I prepared. No, my opening remark was going to be the most important thing is wind pressure. And so therefore, all the people on the side of the boat have got to keep their eyes out of the boat looking for pressure. And that doesn't mean pressure 2 minutes ahead. That means trying to look up the track and see where the pressure is. We had a classic example of that on Friday night, where the breeze was very much easting. And if you got onto the east side, there were lifts all the way up there. So therefore tide became relatively unimportant. The guys who got stuck on the western shore had a lot of trouble getting back. I'm talking about First Division who went to Lady Jane.
Yeah.
But the other thing with tide, in considering that tide, is the difference in the height between low and high. And if you've got a 1 metre tide difference, it's not that important. However, when the tidal difference becomes like 1.7, 1.8, the consideration has to be higher. But it's therefore, I think, knowing when you step on the boat, what is the tide differential and what time of the day is it going to change? And how is that going to affect our approach to the course? Then overlay on top of that, where is best pressure?
If I can add just something to it, and this was screamingly apparent last Saturday, where we had a flood tide for the first beat and an ebb tide for the second beat. And it was very bumpy up the first beat, and with the current, with the wind on the second beat, was flat as a pancake out there, and going to hide in areas of the Mossman Shore and up in there looking for flat water was not even a consideration. The harbour was just easy to get through.
And that brings me to another thing that is, you know, one of the rules, I suppose, about tide. Many people will have heard of the rule of twelfths. And basically, if you divide, you know, your run of tide from low to high, for example, into 12. So the first 15 minutes, it's running at 1. The second 15 minutes, it's at 2. The third 15 minutes, it's running at 3 times, then 3 times, then 2 times, then 1 time. So knowing where you are and where the flow of that tide is going to be most strong, and, you know, during the race and during that tidal flow, the importance of the tide changes and the strength of the tide changes. And so it's important to know when the tide is low and when the tide is high and where you are in that cycle, because that also has a big impact on how you go. But nothing beats the wind and knowing where the wind is when it's happening. But if I can throw something else in, I mean, Sydney Harbour is a classic, and maybe Francis can throw up one of the images that we have. Let's say the flood tide image. And I'll just wait for that to come up. But the location on the harbour is important because, of course, Sydney Harbour is like an L shape, if you like, almost an L shape, a bit of a dog leg that kicks around Bradley's Head. And that makes Bradley's Head a very, very important place on the harbour, both on the flood and on the ebb. And knowing where to be at Bradley's at the right time and how to approach it also has a big impact. How are we going there, Francis? We'll started to share the screen. Yep. I'm waiting for this diagram to come up. We had it up a minute ago.
Actually, you just brought up another point there, and that is the question of knowing where the channels are on the harbour. We talk about the tide on Sydney Harbour and what have you, but how many of us actually give some thought as to where the channels themselves are that we're sailing? If we were commercial skippers, we'd know because we know the markers and what have you, but how many of us sailors actually pay attention to the channels?
Well, John, a simple way to think about that is the channel markers for the East and West Channel. And they're on the edge of it starting to get shallow and anywhere in between there, except where there is a big shallow spot southwest of the Sound Pigs and a bit northeast of the Sound Pigs. And that is a spot where there isn't a lot of current in there in either direction. but generally it sort of follows slowly around the doglegs, as Phil described them earlier, with a few spots that are relatively insignificant.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got our charts back on screen. If we can enlarge them, that'd be great.
Can I just suggest that we have a few comments about approaching Bradley's Head, because, you know, on a Point Piper start heading out into a nor'easter with an incoming tide or an outgoing tide can have a lot of impact about where you go. So, Richard, what would you have to say about that scenario?
Well, firstly, we've been talking flood and ebb all night straight away, and we have a lot of people here who are relatively new to the sport. So can we just define that an ebb tide is an outgoing tide and a flood tide is an incoming tide? And I'm happy to use that terminology in just so we get a balance.
Yep.
So yeah, coming off the line, I know from our One Design Racing, that's one thing One Design Racing does. It teaches you what these minor differences are. And a lot of the handy-rated boats don't pick up on the subtleties. But what does come from One Design Racing is if you leave the start line of Point Piper in an incoming tide, the first boat to Bradley's invariably will get the first shift and will get the cross and will lead around the top mark. And that would probably happen in 90% of cases. And I think the reason is for that is that you are, particularly if you start the leeward, you are going to cross the tide first before the others. You get into that little back eddy that's right there right on Bradley's. And if you can do that in clear air and come back on port tack, either with claiming room or otherwise crossing, which invariably it is because the other boats will be knocking into you, you then pick up the slack water around the next channel marker and then go into Taylor Bay.
And if I may add to that, Richard, the water's a lot flatter once you get past Bradley's, going into the northeast area of Mossman up there. Once, if you draw a line from all these headlands from Bradley's Head and Chowder Bay, George's Head and Middle Head, if you drew, and it's almost a straight line, put a pencil mark on your track, inside there is very little current either direction, but predominantly the water's a lot flatter. You're out of the main disturbance of it, and it's just an easier passage. For a smaller boat, for a big boat, really big boat, 60 foot, doesn't really make much difference. But for the rest of us, we've got to bark our way up there, and that makes a bit of difference if you can get into that area.
Any comments from you, Mark?
Is there much difference in the strength of the tide between east and western shores? The map that we have here doesn't seem to indicate a great deal of difference, but for some reason or other, I've always thought there was more flow on the western shore than the eastern shore. Or is that just a figment of imagination when you're out there sailing?
Was that question to me?
That'll do, yeah.
Okay, well, the first thing I'd have to say is express extreme disappointment that none of us seem to have a better tide chart for Sydney Harbour than what we're seeing on the screen. And as you know, I've been sailing on the Harbour man and boy. I think I first saw this chart 65 years ago. And
Same here.
Surprisingly, it hasn't changed, and nor should it change, because it's the same topography and it's the same water flowing in and out. But I do know that before the Sydney 2000 Olympics, there was huge effort put in by a number of teams to much more accurately plot tides on Sydney Harbour to get much greater granularity than we're seeing in this chart. But sadly, none of that has come into the public domain. The other thing I'd say is that this chart seems to be quite well placed for Friday afternoon sailing, or any sailing that doesn't venture past the line between South Head and Middle Head. So it's completely useless for number 1 division going on up into Manly. Having said that, John, I really don't know where the tide runs hardest, maybe under the Spit Bridge for those who've had that experience of trying to sail a moth or a laser through there in an adverse tide. But can I just take Richard Lawson's comment of maybe 5 minutes ago? And here's where he used both, well, in 2 separate contributions. He was saying that in the classic, say, Etchells start off Point Piper, the first of Bradley's is often the first leg and often the race winner. And that is because you're crossing the tide first. Those behind you on the line have more tide to cross, and I'd like to develop that point a little later on. And then they're able to sail in the tidal, not only the tidal lead, but as Ian Macdiarmid correctly points out, flatter water on the western side, and then are able to cross the harbour just once to get to the top mark, whether it's Beetle Boy or Lady Bay.
And Mark, may I just add there,
please,
you only cross half the tide to get back to the weather mark, and it's in fairly slack current in the middle of the harbour where that mark usually is. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's the other part. You don't see a lot of current once you come back.
So that is what I'd call the classic nor'easter on Sydney Harbour, one which is a true nor'easter. In the first of these seminars, I think we were in, Ian, Rick and myself were in furious agreement that if the wind is not aligned with the harbour, and let's face it, Sydney Harbour is a fabulous place to sail because the main harbour, say between Middle, South Head and Bradley's, aligns almost perfectly with the gradient or with the northeast sea breeze. However, if that, and in that classic nor'easter, it is not only traditional, it is fact that favouring the western shore pays. I think mainly because you can sail in flatter and less adverse current in a flood tide, in an incoming tide, as Rick said. Rick then said later that perhaps last Saturday, I don't recall because I wasn't racing, but in a nor'easter which has a tendency to go east, then the western side of the harbour is to be avoided at all costs because you are getting more favourable, generally stronger wind coming from the east, but you're also getting good slants coming out of both Rose Bay out of Watson's Bay. And that applies, interestingly, whether you're sailing lasers, as I've been doing for the last couple of decades out of Double Bay, whether you're sailing from deeper into Double Bay than the squadron does, up to just short of Shark Island, it always pays to go east in a wind which is slanting from the east, which is nor'easter with easterly tendencies, and then it pays like hell once you're up to Nielsen Park to be on the eastern side of the harbour in that breeze, and that is true in either in tide coming in or ebbing. I'll pause there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Coming
If
from the east, go east.
If I can just add to that, when the squadron were finishing races up on Bottle and Glass, it was always obvious that that last leg for us was coming out of Double Bay or Point Piper, wherever, and heading to Bottle and Glass. So once again, you're on the eastern side of the harbour, but the guys who chose to go down the centre invariably did not pay. the short tacking up towards Steel Point and then working your way up to Bottle and Glass was really worth the effort of the minor shifts taking advantage when they were there. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but let's face it, we're talking about yacht racing, and the majority of times, and we're talking about what the majority of results are.
And Richard, one other point there, this comes from Dave Porter, who raced 12 footers and then 18 footers on the harbour for many years. One race he led at the bottom mark, and at the finishing line he wasn't winning anymore, and there was a lynch mob waiting for him as the punters got off the ferry, and that was in a situation where the tide was ebbing, and he said the wind always goes a little further east later in the day with an ebb tide. And I concentrated on that for years, and he's dead right. If the tide's against the wind, a nor'easter will clock a little bit more east towards the end of the day. This is 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's a good one to put in your memory.
Can we move ourselves up the harbour to Lady Bay, and we're sailing back down towards Clark Island and mark off Clark Island somewhere, and you've got an outgoing tide, not a flood tide. I think this is showing a flood tide. We could show an outgoing or ebb tide, and you're in a nor'easter. What is the preferred course to Clark Island?
So just to confirm it, John, where's the top mark? Which top mark are we going?
Lady Bay. Lady Bay.
Lady Bay. Okay.
Off Watson's Bay.
Yep.
Okay. Can I go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Okay. The two principal geographic features are actually submarine. One is the shoal that Ian Macdiarmid referred to around Sound Pigs. It is quite an extensive shoal. If you look at a map with detailed soundings of Sydney Harbour, so the Sound Pigs is the outcrop of rock with an isolated danger mark and 4 cardinals around it off Green Point, Vaucluse. Yep. So sailing and in an ebb tide, there will be, well, in tide flowing in either directions, there will be what I call a tidal lee on the down tide side of the island. Just think of Clark Island in a nor'easter. There is a wind lee in the lee of it, same with Shark Island. There's a tidal lee, i.e. less current, downstream of Sound Pigs. So I would look to either maximize the use of that in a flood tide or an ebb tide by putting oneself in the maximum current, being aware of that lee. So I'm mixing this up a bit. For tides in either direction, be aware of that lee. But in terms of coming from Lady Bay down, I'd be looking to, in an ebb tide, coming down to, I think the squadron has a mark around Clark Island. In the early part, be very conscious of the Sound Pigs. If the tide's against you, aim at it until you have to go outside the cardinals. And then I would tend to cross to the western shore because of the wind accelerating first of all around George's Head, and then Chowder Head, and then Bradley's Head, and then probably jibe and come across to the Clark Island mark on a port jibe.
Yep.
Right. Okay. And if the tide is flooding, then probably it doesn't matter, does it? It's wind rather than tide. Would that be correct?
Well, if the tide is flooding, there is still a tidal lee, this time on the northern side of the Sound Pigs. If the tide is flooding, the tidal lee would be on the south side of the Sound Pigs.
Yeah.
So you can So I would avoid that area, but rather come to the west of the Sow and Pigs and basically stay more in mid-channel. As Rick, I think, or perhaps Ian pointed out, there are two channels. There's the Eastern Channel and the Western Channel. Of the two, the Western Channel is the deeper and the wider, therefore the current flows more strongly in it. And I would tend to favour the middle of the Western Channel coming south or southwest to the Clark Island mark.
Right.
Can I just jump in there with a definition? I think that once again, for those who are new to the sport, the East Channel and the West Channels are marked by the wedding cakes, and certainly the water is deeper in each of those channels, so therefore the water flows quicker in the deeper part of the harbour. So if you're sailing against a foul tide, so if you're sailing against an outgoing tide and you're coming south, then in the middle of the harbour is better than being either in the West or Eastern Channel, because that's where the water will be flowing quickest.
Unless you can get west of the Western Channel, of course.
Well, that's the only other thing. You cross the West Channel and come down all those headlands on the western side of the main harbour to keep out of the tide. And once again, that becomes very evident in one design racing, where people go straight to that shore in a foul tide and make their way down that, even in and out of some of those bays, just stay out of the pressure, to stay out of the tidal flow.
Yeah.
Just as Richard was saying, I mean, the number of times I've been coming down from Manly in a strong nor'easter and an outgoing tide, big spinnaker up, and you get past George's Head, immediately jibe and go into Obelisk, right in as far as you can to take the benefit of the flatter water and the favourable tide, because it eddies around there, and then jibe back out around the next headland, and then back in again into Chowder Bay, and then out and around and into Taylor Bay, and it just becomes a jibing contest all the way down. And that's one of the reasons why, if you've got a good crew and you're skilled at jibing your spinnaker, you can pick up many places, frankly, as you go down there. People who stay out in the main channel are just going backwards by comparison, because they've got, you know, an extra knot perhaps adverse against them. So
even though they might think they're sailing a shorter distance. Yeah.
No, I totally agree with that. The water's flatter as well, and there's lesser traffic. You don't get the ferries churning the water up as much. And once you're on that western shore, you've got opportunities to hook onto a wave from time to time from a ferry that's passing your way, or a big motorboat of some type. It all sort of adds up. A boat length here and there becomes pretty golden.
Okay. How strong has the breeze to be, or must the breeze be, for you not to worry about tide and just concentrate on sailing your boat?
I'd say about survival strength, John.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. All right. So what you're really doing is you're reinforcing the concept that tide always matters.
Yeah, yes, I am. And can I just pick up on a point that I think Ian made earlier about when you have wind against tide. So let's say you're sailing in a nor'easter and you have an ebb tide, and Ian mentioned that with the ebb tide on maybe the first beat of the race, the water was very bumpy, but then it had smoothed right out because the wind was with the tide, i.e. now flooding, in the second or subsequent beats. And this is often quite dichotomous. It doesn't feel right, but believe me, it is. If you're sailing in wind against tide and it's uncomfortable, by which I mean in a yacht, you seem to be chopping a lot of water, and the boat is not moving easily over the swells or the chop, as it may normally do. In a laser, you can it reads as if the boat's underwater most of the time because the water's coming green over the bow. That's actually a good thing because it means you're in a strong, favourable tide. And that's something that, as I say, is quite dichotomous, but it is a good read on whether you are sailing in a favourable current, i.e. adverse to the wind when you are working, say, into a nor'easter.
Yeah, and also there, Mark, that's a boat that sails at 4.5 knots to windward. So the tide is a big part of the laser sailing.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. I was interested to hear Tom Slingsby talk about racing GP50s on the harbour. And those things go, as we all know, very fast upwind and down. So fast that it is really idle to be trying to take up, to tack on small shifts. You've got to make a decision and go to one side or the other. And frankly, that is not really tide dependent. It really comes back to tide or wind shift dependent. It comes back to wind pressure.
Wind pressure.
Yeah. Yeah.
They wouldn't worry about tide at all, would they?
I don't think so, John. I've never been allowed to sail when I'm too old.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess. Well, have we covered the nor'easter? Well, certainly in the main harbour, anyway.
Yeah.
Should we go to a southerly, or should we look at the nor'easter with an incoming tide? No, we've done that, haven't we? No, we haven't.
John.
We've done that.
We've touched it, yeah.
Yeah, we've done that.
Okay. Well, should we go to a southerly or a sou'easter? Southerly, starting in Athlone and going up to Clark Island or Double Bay and then down to Obelisk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With a what have we got up? We've got an outgoing tide up. Well, let's leave the outgoing tide up.
Yep.
Someone
If I
take the
could
lead
just
on that.
jump in for a minute.
Yep.
I've just pulled it up, a Navionics chart of Sydney Harbour, and to the point that I think Mark made about the standard of that tide chart that we have in front of us. The channels are dredged to something like 15 or 16 metres, whereas outside of the channel, typically the deepest you'll get is about 7 metres. So, there's a hell of a lot more depth there, this is just putting some numbers on what we're doing that gives you an understanding of why those channels play a very big part, in the water moving in and moving out, and why getting out of the channels, if you're in adverse conditions, makes a big difference. So, just think of the amount of water that's flowing in 16 metres versus flowing in 7 or 8 metres. That makes a very, very big difference. Sorry to interrupt, but I just thought it was worth looking up and giving some numbers on that.
Phil, if I could add something to that, I had the great privilege of seeing the Southampton University's model of the Solent, where they ran a flood and an ebb tide through. And what actually happens there, because there are a lot more shallows than we have on Sydney Harbour, but when the tide changes, it moves in the shallows first, and it actually comes straight off the shallows, and that just turns around and drops into the deep parts. So it could be the tide, the very small amount of tide when it starts to change, comes off at 90 degrees to the main flow as it develops. It was pretty interesting to watch.
So just to expand on that a little bit, the depth of the harbour underneath the Kentucky Fried Mark there off Bradley's Head is around 24 metres.
Yeah.
And so you've got that very deep part of the harbour there where the water turns around.
Yeah.
The Eastern Channel, by comparison, is probably about 12 metres as opposed to 16 in the Western Channel. So that gives you some idea of just how the water moves and the relative strength on each side.
Agreed.
And that's why that stretch of water between the Kentucky Fried Chicken and the and the Bradley's Head is a critical area for all racing, whether it doesn't matter whether the tide's in or out, but that's critical, and you've got to consider that, what effect that might have, and is there any back eddy there that you can work with?
Yeah.
Now, can I just make a comment here? Richard, you unpacked a few things earlier in the webinar to those who might not have been in the sport of sailing on Sydney Harbour very long. The so-called Kentucky Fried Chicken mark is the red and white mark off Bradley's Head. It is correctly called a fair watermark, and it's there to separate inbound and outbound traffic. I did not think that it was called the Kentucky Fried Chicken mark. It was in the yacht squadron. I thought that terminology was reserved for my scaly mates sailing lasers out of Double Bay. We should refer to it by its correct name, the fair watermark off Bradley's Head.
Thank you, Lord Bethwaite.
And if I can add to that, gentlemen, there is a 90-miler parked underneath it in that deep spot. There was a collision between two colliers one night in horrible conditions. One was going up the harbour, one's going down the harbour, and they collided with the loss of, I think, 1 or 2 lives. This is pre-1930s, and that mark, I believe, is parked on top of a collier.
Interesting. Didn't know that.
But whenever sailing past that mark, crew should have their eyes out of the boat and just watch what the current's doing. That mark is, and any other fixed mark around the harbour is always a great indicator of what is actually happening with tidal flow.
Yep.
And it not only will tell you which direction the tide flowing, it'll tell you to what extent. But you can tell by the chopped up water around the mark which direction and how much there is.
Yeah,
That's a very good point, actually.
it is.
Yeah. Okay. Shall we get down to Athelbite?
I believe there was a southerly coming in you were talking about, John.
That's right. That's the southerly.
Yeah.
Okay. So the course is now out of Athol, up to Double Bay, down to Obelisk, and you've got an outgoing tide. Any smart ideas?
Yeah, I'd just like to. We sail that quite a bit in the squadrons racing on Saturdays, and I don't worry about the tide at all. I just try to hook into the ships, because around Clark Island, it comes out of Rustcutters Bay, or it comes out of Rose Bay, not Rose
Double
Bay, Double Bay, and you just got to have a look at it and try to figure out when it's going to hit from the eastern side and time that to get to the mark, because the mark's right under Point Piper. It's always in a horrid position where that final approach, if you can hook into that one, you're gold. If you can hook into it with southerly rather than a dash of east in it on Clark Island, and I don't think the tide has anything to do with it. To me, it's just all wind, and I welcome anybody else's comment that they wish to make on that.
Okay. Richard?
I would agree with that. I would agree with that, in particular because as those current lines are drawn on the chart that we have, the water's fairly slack where the starting line is set, which is deeper into Athol. Those those current lines are shown. But as you come, let's say you're out where we can see those current lines, it is very difficult in a southerly to lee bow that current, that adverse current that you can see going into Athelbite and then swinging around Bradley's Head. So I agree totally with Ian. Forget the tide, focus on wind. The tide is basically across the course.
Okay. And you don't worry about tide down the run to Obelisk either, I presume?
No, just go like hell.
Just go like hell, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I got a provision on that one. going like hell's fine in the straight line, but invariably what happens, people start playing with each other and go up above the ley line. And invariably the guy who's game enough at the beginning to sail deep and come out around about Taylor Bay, Chowder, invariably will end up gaining by doing that. Once again, going back to one design, invariably the low course down that track pays against the guys who sail high, then try to go deep later on. Invariably, the southerly pressure tends to bend around there. And what tends to happen, the guys who have gone high tend to end up sailing squarer coming into the mark and therefore slow.
Really struggle, yeah. The only issue generally is if there's a dash of east in that, you've got to really work hard to get up when in the lighter stuff when you can and get away in the fresh stuff, or you've got a problem with George's Head.
Yep.
And as often happens, you go around the mark there at Point Piper, and the wind is is usually on the bow. It's quite shy, and so the ability to go deep, as Richard says, and then as it frees up as you get further down the course, often means that you can do better than those who tend to go up high and try and carry each other up high and muck around with their skis, try to get them up too early.
Yeah, that's my point.
Is exactly the way to go. Yep.
Okay. Having gone like a bat out of hell all the way to Obelisk, and you're in about 15 knots of southerly or more, and you get around Obelisk, now the whole thing changes, doesn't it? With your outgoing tide, where you didn't have to worry about the tide going up to Double Bay, you didn't have to worry about the tide going down to Obelisk, but now it's a different game, is it not? Someone pick that up?
Yeah, it tends to pay to stay on that western shore in exactly the same way as if it was a nor'easter. Stay up the shore there, and sometimes, depending where your mark is, if your mark is, sorry, I'm pointing to it.
I'm sorry, we're going from Obelisk to say Shark Island or thereabouts. Okay.
Yeah, or Rose Bay is a mark up there. Yeah. Quite often, if it is a really true southerly, just taking a long beat all the way up that shore, tacking and going to the west of Shark Island pays like hell. Not all the time, but when it does, it really does pay. And I would suggest that that's 30% of the time, possibly.
I agree. But
so,
you can only do that with an outgoing tide, because once you get to Bradley's, you start to leave out that tide that's coming around Bradley's, and it really has a dramatic effect.
Yep.
And if I can just recount a race a couple of weeks back, I was sailing on Takana in Division 2 in the combined clubs, and the race started Towler or Chowder, I just don't remember which, but we very quickly flopped on to port and went along the western shore, and everybody else was working way up to the east towards Steel Point. But we hung and we actually got all the way to the moorings at the Edwards on Port Tack, tacked there, and we actually almost laid the convent mark and came out way ahead of our opposition in Division 2. There were only one or two of the faster boats that beat us to that mark, and that actually made the race for us, just that one leg.
I can assure you, Richard, people like you make me cringe.
Why is that, Ian?
I don't pick it often enough.
It's a golden rule.
But it's beautiful to see, I can assure you.
Yeah, well, you come ashore and they all say you're a burglar, you know.
Yeah.
Mark, have you got any comments after coming around Obelisk and up to Shark or
Okay.
Rose Bay?
My approach would be quite different depending on the top mark. If you're going to a mark near Clark Island, then I think a Western Shore strategy pays, particularly in an adverse tide. You can see in an adverse tide there, those eddies coming into Obelisk and into Taylor Bay on the eastern side of Bradley's Head. And so a western side strategy pays, providing there's good wind there. That's my overlay on everything I say. And if your objective is Clark Island, that's great. However, if your objective is Rose Bay, Convent Mark, or a mark deep in Rose Bay, or even what used to be called the totem pole on Shark Island, then getting across to Nielsen Park, taking shifts to get east so that you depart really the southern tip. It's called Steel Point of the Nielsen Park of Steel Point, otherwise known as Nielsen Park. You then take a port tack across towards Shark Island, and as you can see there from the tidal flow, you're in relatively slack water. You're in something of a tidal lee of Shark Island, and there's more to be said about the way Shark Island does impact the tide in an ebb tide, particularly if you're sailing from Taylor Bay up into Rose Bay. That's a separate matter. In order not to confuse, I'll leave it there. But if your objective is Rose Bay rather than Clark Island, then you've got to get to Steel Point. And again, it's better to cross the tide once, cross the foul tide once rather than multiple times.
Can I just chime in here and say that we've been focusing a lot on the Saturday courses, I suppose, with the nor'easter and sou'easter, with starts at Athol or Point Piper and heading up around the harbour. Many of the members only sail on a Friday evening in the twilights, and you start down at Kirribilli off the club, and the course generally goes around the naval mark and then down to further down the harbour. The bigger boats go down to Lady Bay. Some boats go into Chowder Bay, some boats go around the Beashel mark, and then back around Shark Island and back in. Might be worth just looking at that course because I think there's a lot of people who'd be interested in how the tide runs in that. What do you think, Richard?
I could agree with you more, Frosty. And at the moment, we have so many people doing twilighting, and all that racing is out of Kirribilli, frustrating as it is. That's the worst place in the world to start a nor'easter. But can I start off by saying, if you start in Kirribilli and there's an outgoing tide and the breeze in the southeast, you've got to go to Fort Denison, because the tide that runs around Fort Denison and Garden Island there is a real elevator. And you're not in it for very long, but the longer you can stay in that piece of water between Fort Denison and Garden Island and use that bit of tide, it's quite dramatic what effect you can have.
And on an incoming tide?
Incoming tide, just go up the middle. You stay away from there because, once again, that's a deep spot. The water flows. So if the water is flowing against you, if it's an incoming tide, then stay away from that. So what works in an outgoing tide and a sou'easter doesn't necessarily work on an incoming tide. So you've got to go up the middle in the shallower water where there's less flow, and then cross across into at the appropriate time when the shifts are right. Once again, the shifts out of Rushcutters Bay are so critical. Once again, we're talking breeze in the southeast. The shifts coming out of Rushcutters Bay are so critical. It's important to go across and get on the right shift at the right time, eyes out of the boat, looking a couple of 100 metres ahead.
And you almost never round that naval 2 mark without having the favourable wind more east than south. Would you guys agree there?
Yeah.
What basic breeze direction are we talking here? Southeast?
Almost anything, Mark. Yeah, southeast, south.
Yeah.
Even nor'east, you tend to get into the real nor'east stuff there, where it flicks around until you get almost to the mark. It goes through 10 or 15 degrees.
Yeah.
And pressures.
In a nor'easter, to my mind, it's forget the tide, just go like hell. It's the classic up in the lows and away the gust stuff from the start line to that naval number 2.
Yeah.
So there's something also that should be added to this. Most of the discussion we've had to date has been, as I said, around the Saturday racing courses, and typically, you know, the races start, you know, early afternoon. Whereas for the twilights, we're starting in the evening, and the nor'easter, when it's in, is generally honking. You've got a black nor'easter quite often. The wind conditions are a lot different, and we're not often out in those sorts of conditions on a Saturday, but on the Friday night races, you know, the harbour has got a different complexion and the wind has got a different complexion. Ian, what do you take out of that, and what do you think about those comments?
Oh, first question, Phil, what direction are we talking here? Sea breeze?
Well, you can comment on any direction you like. It's really the difference between the time of day and what it does to the wind, you know, say a nor'easter or a southerly or a sou'easter.
A nor'easter, I think we pretty much covered earlier. A sou'easter or a southerly.
Except that the wind is often a lot stronger in the afternoon, late.
Yeah, it is. I think that the southerly is more interesting, where you just work a couple of shifts, get around that first mark naval 2, and then the biggest, forgetting the current here, but the biggest error people make is sailing way above the mark early. A good, for that reach down the harbour there in a southeasterly or southerly, you've got to do a bit of a scallop. You've got to get down low, work every gust down low. Every gust you get it away, because once you get to Vaucluse, Steel Point area, the breeze is going to be a hell of a lot lighter and a little bit more gusty, and it's good to be coming back up into it. Now, if you have that big slack part of tide around the Sow and Pigs, it extends almost through to Steel Point there, that shallow area, and that's the time when you get the lighter winds. You can come up, you can sail through that area. If you're going to Lady Bay, get to the south of the Sow and Pigs and make your approach that way. Have you guys been able to follow my ramblings there?
Ian, I agree with you. And one of the mantras on our boat, particularly with the lesser experienced people on board, is when we're reaching down there, away in the pressure, up in the light.
Absolutely.
Keep the boat pressured up, but every time there's an opportunity to get away, do so, because there are so many other opportunities further down the harbour, once again, the southeasterly, where you can then come up and keep the pressure on the boat.
Yeah. It's more important than the current there, I think, either way.
Yeah, I can't add to that.
Okay, coming back.
Yeah, you've gone around. What happens when you come back?
Steel Point. Stay the hell away from Steel Point. If you come around Steel Point, if you're on the number 1 course, that's from Lady Bay to Steel Point and then Shark Island. When you come around Steel Point, if it's a nor'easterly or near nor'east, you seriously need to be aiming at Shark Island for 2/3 of that period of time from Steel Point to Shark Island, and then come up, because you'll get much better breeze that way. If you come up high around Steel Point, there's a good chance you'll be parked there while the fleet goes past. Now, sometimes you're sort of pressed and forced up higher than you'd like to go, but you can do almost anything and try to keep away from it. It just doesn't pay.
I would support those comments. My experience with all of the better sailors in a nor'easter in twilight racing tend to sail that nor'east leg quite deep, ending sort of going towards Shark Island wedding cake, and then at the appropriate time, then jibing the headsail or whatever it might be, and then reaching in to the Shark Island mark. Invariably, you're coming in at twice the speed of the boats above you, and invariably you'll gain an overlap at the rounding mark and pick up 4 or 5 boats that are all jammed together, coming in slowly.
Yep, and also be in minimal tide, whether it's flooding or it's ebbing. There's very little there to talk about.
Yeah, not enough tide there to worry about.
Agreed.
And then to go on from there, once you get around the shark mark, quite often there are gains to be made by delaying your jibe and staying in the pressure, because there is a hell of a lee behind Shark Island, and only when you get a wee bit of north in the wind, where you will be fairly close reaching all the way down, does it pay to not jibe immediately at that corner and just head straight for home.
Anything from you on that, Richard? Anything more?
No, I agree with that comment.
As do I.
Well, look, we're now 3 minutes to 7, getting close to the end of this little seminar. I suppose it's probably worth looking at closing remarks and commentary. John, do you have anything you'd like to make on this?
I can't talk over the top of these guys. I'll just sit back and listen to them. They've both been my skippers from time to time, or 2 of them have, not Richard.
Not me. I'd love for you to come for a sail.
I'll do that. I think first to Mark, then to Richard, then to Macca.
Okay, I'd just like to make one point that hasn't been, well, that I touched on very briefly, but I'd just like to reinforce. In a nor'easter, there is, let's say you're talking the Etchells fleet or any of the division fleets starting off Point Piper. If you start at the leeward end, you have crossed more tide already than your competitors at the weather end. Just think about it, that they have that extra 100 meters or 70 meters, whatever it may be, to sail in an adverse current, and you've already sailed by positioning yourself on the line to leeward. Can I turn that around? Ian, John, and I sailed together in a J24 World Championships back in '82 on the harbour. The start was off Obelisk, and it was a strong ebb tide. And whilst the line was fairly square, we made the decision to start at the leeward end because we had already crossed a significant portion of the tide, more than our competitors that were bunched up to windward, and we just blew them away. So just think about that as to how the line is set and how the water is flowing across that line. See if you can save time in a foul current by placing your boat on the line.
I'll just jump in there. We've got 3 questions that are sitting in the Q&A here, and I'll quickly put them to everybody. The first one is, well, where are we able to acquire detailed hourly tide flow charts? And I think, Mark, you made the comment that despite all the work that was done at the Olympics, there's not a lot of that information that's been generally available. Does anybody have any better information on how the tides work on an hourly basis, or whether there's any information around that? I'm not familiar with it.
Well, Phil, as you know, when we were preparing for this seminar, I and others put the question, is there nothing better than what we're seeing on the screen at the moment?
Yeah.
And there seems to be not. I know work's been done, but it just hasn't seen the light of day. So to the questioner, I'd have to say, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any, but here's an opportunity for somebody to fill a need which has been extant for some time here.
Look, I'm sure there's probably some very detailed navigation work or charts, very expensive too, that will probably give you a lot of that information, but it's not generally available, and it's available for a price. Okay, there's another one here that says, just to confirm, with an easterly tending breeze, regardless of the flow, including outgoing tide, it is better to hug the eastern shore.
That is my view. By hug the eastern shore, make it your business to pass close by Steel Point on starboard and then continue to sail east of the rum line from Steel Point, once you get past Bottle and Glass, into Watson's Bay, so that you are taking advantage of shifts from the right.
Agreed.
I agree with that.
Well, that's unanimous. Thank you for that one. Now, those two questions were both anonymous, so I don't know who they're from, but David Ross has put a question in saying that in an ebb tide, northeast wind, sailing down to Shark Island on the western side, comment was to jibe in and out of the headlands. How much wind shadow is there under these headlands?
None.
None. Yeah.
And
Actually,
the reason is
There's
because
pressure.
the wind actually bends around the headlands.
Yeah,
And
it does.
it twists around, and you carry the wind all the way in, and then you jibe out again, and the wind actually takes you out again. It's a really cute little trick, that one.
Yeah.
I agree with that too.
I agree.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the wind is what you see on the water. That's one of the great beauties of sailing. So much of it can be seen with the naked eye.
And a good set of Polaroid glasses.
Yeah. And quite often, a lot of the time, you're sailing a bit by the lead to just prolong the simplicity of staying in the gust, the good gust, and stretching it out. And when it is time to jibe, it's good to work your way out of the gust. Then you get the angle of the gust when you jibe back and use the gust twice. If people think about that, that's always a nice philosophy to have. Be greedy with it, really get into it.
Well, thank you, guys. I'll take this opportunity to wrap up. I'd like to thank Mark and Richard and Ian, and thank you, John, for putting most of this together for us. I think it's one of these wonderful things that we can do for the club, is allow people to get together and understand some of the skill and the experience that sits around the membership, and pass that on to the other members. So that just helps you in your enjoyment of the time on Sydney Harbour. And Alison, thank you very much for your efforts. And hopefully we'll see you again, everybody, on another Cocktail Hour Zoom room. Cheers and good night.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night, all.
Thank you, Phil.
Thanks,
Thank you, John. Panelists.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Good night.
See you.